It was 8:15 in the morning, August 6th, 1945. The sky above Hiroshima was blue, cloudless, and still. Mothers walked their children to school. Men in factory uniforms checked their watches. A few soldiers were drilling near the river, shouting half-hearted orders under the rising Sunday. No one imagined the sky itself was watching them. Then, in less than a second, a light brighter than the Sunday, a heat beyond fire. And then, nothing. The city, once alive with footsteps, laughter, and the hum of bicycles, vanished into silence. Not noise, not chaos, just absence. As if the entire world had taken one sharp breath and never exhaled again. Those who lived through it still remember the quiet. No wind, no birds, no human cry. Only the faint ringing in their ears and the sound of their own heartbeat. By noon, more than 70,000 were gone. Many never even heard the sound that took them. Historians call it the atomic age's beginning, but for the people of Hiroshima, it began with silence, a silence so complete it split memory from reality. What did that silence mean? How can the absence of sound echo for 80 years? And how did those who survived ever find the strength to speak again? That's the story we'll uncover tonight. The story of the morning the world fell quiet. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing. It helps keep these human memories alive long after those who lived them are gone. The morning began like any other. The cicadas hummed over wooden rooftops. Streetcars rattled toward the station. School children in white shirts waved to soldiers passing by. At 8:15, the light came. For 1/3 of a second, everything was illuminated: walls, windows, faces, as if a giant lantern had opened above the city. Then came the pressure. The air itself collapsed. Buildings folded like paper. Bodies were lifted, thrown, burned, erased. And yet, no sound followed. No explosion, thunder. No screaming rush of wind. Only a suffocating silence that swallowed the city whole. Setsuko Thurlow was 13. She had just started morning assembly at her school. When the flash struck, she felt herself rising, pinned beneath beams, trapped in total darkness. She said later, "It was a silence you could feel, total, absolute. I thought I was dead." For several seconds, maybe minutes, she couldn't tell. Nothing moved, no voices, no footsteps. Only the faint crackle of distant fire beginning to breathe through the rubble. Then, somewhere nearby, someone whispered her name, a voice trembling inside the black dust. She called back, realizing she could still speak, that she was still alive. Outside, the city had already ceased to exist. Blocks of wooden homes had disintegrated into ash. People had vanished before their shadows hit the ground. Those left behind crawled through ruins, dazed, bleeding, unable to comprehend what had happened. But none of them screamed. They couldn't. Their lungs were scorched, their ears shattered. Even fear was silent. Hiroshima was gone, but it hadn't yet made a sound. And in that silence, the survivors began to understand something beyond war had just been born. Yet the silence wasn't peace. It was the beginning of a new kind of terror, a world where even the air refused to speak. They expected thunder. They expected chaos, the roar of flames, the rush of wind, the cries of the dying. Instead, there was nothing, a silence so thick it pressed on the ears like water. Even the air refused to move. Father Wilhelm Siems, a German priest stationed on the outskirts, wrote later, "The city seemed to have inhaled and never exhaled." He stepped outside his shattered mission house and saw a grey haze rising where the city had been. No birds, no footsteps, only an unnatural calm, like a photograph that had come to life and then stopped again. For the few who still breathed inside the ruins, sound had lost meaning. Some survivors thought they'd gone deaf. Others believed time itself had ended. Setsuko Thurlow remembered opening her eyes to a sky she could not see. Dust had blotted out the Sunday. When she tried to stand, the silence broke only by the faint hiss of falling ash. She whispered, "Mother?" But no answer came back. Down by the Motoyasu River, survivors staggered toward the banks. Their clothes hung in ribbons, their skin the color of clay. They didn't speak, they simply moved, one step at a time, as if drawn by some invisible tide. A few minutes later, another silence descended, different this time. The fires began to breathe, faint at first, then louder, devouring the wooden city. But between each crackle, the quiet returned, heavier than before. Michihiko Hachiya, a doctor at the communications hospital, later wrote in his diary, "I heard no one cry out. The world was filled with a silence that was unbearable. For those who survived the blast, that absence of sound became the sound of horror itself. Not the noise of destruction, but the realization that no one was left to make it. And still, beyond the dust and smoke, the city waited for someone, anyone, to speak." Then, faintly, it began, a voice here, another there, the first fragile sounds of life trying to answer back to death. At first, it was only one voice, then another. Faint, trembling sounds rising through the smoke like dying embers. A woman's cry for her child, a boy whispering for water, someone calling a name that would never answer back. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, writing from the ruins of his hospital, remembered it clearly. The silence was broken by small voices, low moans, pleas for help, but they were weak and soon gone. In the wreckage of a collapsed school, 13-year-old Setsuko Thurlow heard the same. Her classmates pinned under beams called out, one by one, "Mother, help me! God, help me!" Then nothing. The silence came back, swallowing their words like the tide. She crawled free, hours later, barefoot, dazed, her hair burned to ash. All around her were silhouettes, black shadows, etched onto walls where people had stood. They had been talking 1 second ago. Now, only outlines remained. Down by the river, hundreds gathered. Men and women stepped into the water, trying to cool their burns. They didn't scream. They just stood, staring blankly ahead, their bodies trembling. The water turned red, then black. From the distance, faint cries continued, "Help, water." But each one grew softer. The heat and radiation had stolen even the strength to call for mercy. In the middle of that stillness, a strange sound echoed, dripping. Drops of molten glass falling from broken windows, hitting the ground like raindrops on stone. It was the only rhythm the city had left. By nightfall, even that faded. The fires glowed against the dark sky, yet the world beneath them was silent again. Those who could still move searched blindly through the ruins. Every few steps, they stopped listening. Sometimes they thought they heard a voice, but it was just the wind finally returning. Hachiya wrote later, "It was as if the earth had decided to rest." That night, Hiroshima fell completely silent for the first time in its history, and that silence became its monument. By morning, the living began to move, but their world no longer breathed. The silence had spread beyond sound into everything. Morning came, but there was no dawn. The sky was the color of rusted smoke. Ash drifted like snow over what had once been streets. Those who survived began to rise from the ruins slowly, silently, unsure whether the world outside still existed. They wandered barefoot, skin peeled, eyes clouded. Some carried buckets, some carried nothing at all. No one spoke. The city had lost its breath. The telephones were dead. The radio station was gone. Every messenger, every runner, every wire cut in an instant. Even the clock towers had melted, frozen forever at 8:15. Yoshito Matsushige, a press photographer, walked through the devastation with his camera still hanging from his neck. He wanted to take a picture to prove what he saw was real, but his hands trembled so violently he couldn't press the shutter. He later said, "There were people alive around me, but it was too quiet. The silence was unbearable." A policeman, bleeding from his forehead, tried to give orders. No one heard him. His voice broke halfway through and never returned. Near the river, rescuers tried to call for help, but their throats were dry and burned. They waved their arms instead, pointing toward the flames. Signals replaced words, gestures replaced language. It was as if Hiroshima had turned into a silent film motion without sound. Dr. Hachiya wandered the ruins of his hospital, searching for survivors. He found one nurse standing, dazed, staring at her hands. She whispered, "Where are the others?" He didn't answer. There were no others. By midday, the fires were still burning. The wind finally came, carrying the smell of iron and rain. For the first time since the blast, the city made a sound. The crack of collapsing timbers, the hiss of steam, and the faint sob of a woman kneeling beside the ashes of her home. But for most, even these sounds were distant, dreamlike. Their ears rang endlessly from the pressure. They heard nothing, yet felt everything. It was the silence of isolation, the moment when every survivor realized they were truly alone. And yet, in that stillness, something fragile began to stir, a whisper of life refusing to disappear. At first, it was just a whisper, a cough in the dust, a single footstep breaking through the ash. Then, slowly, other sounds followed, shuffling, sobbing, the rustle of fabric as people crawled toward the light. For the first time since the flash, the silence began to crack. Akiko Takakura was one of the few inside the Hiroshima bank who lived. She woke beneath the rubble, covered in soot. Her ears rang, her body burned, but she could hear something faint, a voice calling, "Is anyone alive?" She answered back. That echo, just 2 words, became her reason to move. Nearby, others began to do the same. A mother whispered her child's name into the ruins until she heard a small cry in return. Neighbors tapped on debris with shards of wood, listening for a reply. Every tap was a heartbeat proof that the world hadn't ended completely. Dr. Hachiya found a nurse still alive. Her arms were burned, her face pale, but she was bandaging another person's wounds. When he asked her why, she said quietly, "Because someone must." The survivors started to organize not through words, but through instinct. They tore cloth for bandages, shared water, lifted beams. Those who could walk carried those who couldn't. Some prayed, others simply held hands. Each small gesture broke another piece of the silence. Life was beginning to speak again in murmurs, not speeches. Akiko later said, "I heard someone humming. It wasn't a song, just a sound. But it told me we were still human. The fires were still burning, the bodies still smoldered, yet amidst it all came the first fragile melody of survival, a harmony made of breath, pain, and determination. For many, that sound became the only thing worth living for. If this moment of courage moves you, share this video. Every share keeps these voices alive, so the silence of Hiroshima is never repeated. By night, those who survived gathered along the riverbanks. They had nothing, no homes, no food, no answers, but they were together. Some prayed aloud, others sat quietly, holding hands under the orange glow of a burning sky. Hiroshima was no longer silent. It was whispering not of death, but of survival. But even as the city began to breathe again, another silence settled, one that would last for decades. When the fires finally died, Hiroshima was nothing but ash and memory. Yet for those who lived, the silence did not end that day. It followed them. It clung to their dreams, their homes, their voices. In the years after the war, survivors Hibakusha rarely spoke. Some feared being shunned for radiation sickness. Others believed no one could ever understand what they had seen. Many carried a quiet shame, as if survival itself had been a betrayal. Toshiko Tanaka was 6 when the bomb fell. She would not speak of it again for 65 years. She said later, "In Japan, silence was seen as strength. But this silence, it was a wound that never closed." Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, whose diary had captured the first days after the blast, stopped writing for months. Even he, a man of science, could not find words big enough for what he had witnessed. He wrote simply, "I could not speak of it. The words would not come." And so, for decades, Hiroshima's survivors lived with that invisible echo. Some avoided crowds. Some never again celebrated birthdays. Many said the worst sound of all was laughter, because it reminded them of what was lost. Yet time, like sound, finds its way back. As the years passed, new generations began to ask questions. Children of survivors, now grey-haired themselves, urged their parents to speak, to break the silence, and one by one, they did. Toshiko Tanaka stood before students and told her story. Setsuko Thurlow spoke before the United Nations, her voice trembling but clear. Akiko Takakura donated her blood-stained uniform to the Hiroshima Peace Museum. Every word they spoke broke another layer of that old silence. Today, each August 6th, at exactly 8:15, a bell rings over Hiroshima. Its chime echoes across the city, soft, solemn, endless. It is not the sound of grief alone, it is the sound of a city remembering how to breathe. The silence never left entirely, but now it has meaning. It is the pause before a prayer, the quiet before a vow. Because sometimes silence doesn't end a story, it keeps it alive. 80 years have passed. The city that once vanished in silence now hums with life. Trams roll down bright streets. Children laugh in schoolyards built where ash once fell. Cherry blossoms bloom where shadows were once burned into stone. Yet if you stand in the Peace Park at dawn, before the tourists arrive, you can still feel it, that silence. Not the silence of death, but of remembrance. The rivers that carried away the wounded now reflect lanterns, each August 6th, floating gently down the current. Each one bears a name, each one a memory whispered back to the water. The survivors say that sound is no longer what they remember most, it's the quiet between them. The pause before a bell tolls. The breath before someone says, "Never again." Because Hiroshima's story isn't just about destruction. It's about endurance, about a city that learned to turn silence into meaning and pain into prayer. Setsuko Thurlow once said, "That morning we fell silent, but the silence became our voice." And that voice, passed through generations, is still speaking not in anger, but in remembrance. A whisper turned into a vow turned into peace. Today, when the bell rings at 8:15, it carries more than sorrow. It carries a reminder that silence can destroy, but it can also heal if we listen. If you believe these memories must never fade, subscribe and join us. Together, we'll keep the echoes of history alive, one human story at a time. The US called it victory. Hiroshima called it survival. And the world still calls it silence. But within that silence lives something eternal, the sound of memory and the promise that it will never fall quiet again.